Thank you, Alice. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure and an honor to come to Nuuk. As Alice mentioned, I am an outsider. I'm a native of Southern California. My grandparents were from Estonia, Germany, Russia, and Austria. So I have a cultural sense of the world. Was all continents before I was 30 years old. Building on the comments by Premier Kielsen in terms of empowerment of indigenous peoples, and President Grimson's comments about global responsibility for sustainability of the Arctic. This is the neighborhood. The neighborhood is now in the middle of the world. The Arctic Ocean, surrounded by Arctic coastal states, non-coastal states, indigenous peoples in both non-Arctic states and global society, all focusing on the Arctic Ocean. In this discussion, we've heard the term sustainability mentioned many times. A question for each of you. What is sustainability mean to you? And secondly, how will you achieve sustainability? The answers to these questions are as diverse as the people in this room. These are maps of the Arctic, each one representing different perspectives of sustainability, fisheries, economics, peoples. They all are perspectives of the Arctic. Different types of perspectives, institutional perspectives. This is the world we live in. The world has different perspectives of the Arctic, and the challenges that are represented in this room are how to balance these different perspectives. We know that the Arctic as a region is going through fundamental changes. The Arctic Ocean itself is a new Arctic Ocean. The surface of the Arctic Ocean, which had been permanent sea ice for thousands of years, multi-year sea ice, is now open water across more than 50% of its surface. If we think of the Arctic Ocean as a system, imagine this room. On the floor of the room, we have a floor, we've got the walls, we've got inflow and outflow through the doors, just like the North Pacific and North Atlantic, and we've got a ceiling. If we took the ceiling off this room and all of us were exposed to the wind and the rain and the snow and the cold, guaranteed our interactions would be fundamentally different. And this is what is happening to the Arctic. The ceiling to the Arctic Ocean has been removed, and as a consequence, there are risks of political, economic, and cultural instability. These risks are important to address with hope and inspiration for present as well as future generations. This is a brief timeline. Certainly none of you can read, but on the far left side is a speech by President Gorbachev in 1987, and the far right side is 2014. In looking at this, oops, I didn't want to do that. There was a fundamental change in 2007, 2008. There were several things that happened in that year. One was that there was the International Polar Year, which was science. It brought attention of the world to the polar regions, and things began to change in the Arctic. There were some other fundamental activities that happened during that period. In 2007, there was a planting of a flag at the North Pole, ostensibly a Russian flag, but it was a private expedition. In 2008, there was the Ilulissat Declaration of 5 Arctic states declaring their sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdiction in the Arctic Ocean. These are important in terms of the timeline, in terms of transition. Before 2007, 2008, focusing on the Arctic Council and its set of common Arctic issues, sustainable development was identified as one of them. But in 2007, 2008, as an international community, we began to transition to a phase of investment and implementation in the Arctic. This is where we are today. This is the discussion in this room. We are entering a phase of investment and implementation. The challenge for everyone in this room is to understand and apply solutions that will achieve sustainability in the Arctic, to make sure that these investments are wise investments, not just for the present, but for generations into the future. And the concept of future has been introduced many times in this discussion. I've written down a few of the context of future. We talk about education. Education is in terms of future generations, not 5 years, 10 years, but generations into the future. We talk about energy. Energy thinks in terms of exploration, development, and production, 3 to 5 decades in the future. The land claims acts that were mentioned yesterday, those took decades to negotiate. Climate operates over decades to centuries. There is the concept of 7 generations. Marine mammals live decades. All of these issues, opportunities, suggest that our time frame in terms of thinking about sustainability is decades into the future. Maybe not 50 years, perhaps even across the 21st century. This is a notion of infrastructure that is being developed. I would suggest in order to develop sustainable infrastructure, that it's not just the built elements. Certainly the built elements are important, mobile and fixed assets, communication systems, research systems, observing systems, information systems. These are what are being discussed here. But to be sustainable, the infrastructure must combine the built elements with the governance mechanisms, regulatory devices, policy devices, including insurance, in terms of the governance mechanisms. For example, a few years ago in 2011, an agreement on search and rescue was adopted by the Arctic states. This is a perfectly forward-looking agreement, but in the absence of the built elements to implement it, it's a hollow agreement. Same with the 2013 agreement on marine pollution preparedness and response. In order for the solutions of infrastructure to be sustainable, they must combine both the built elements and the governance mechanisms. In terms of thinking about the Arctic Ocean, there are regions that are unambiguous in terms of potential impacts. One of those is in the Bering Strait region, north of Alaska, north of Chukotka. It is a region that is impacted potentially by increased traffic across the Northern Sea Route, increased traffic across the Northwest Passage, and as the ice continues to retreat across the North Pole, there will be a polar route. Plus we have inflow and outflow through the North Pacific. In terms of thinking about sustainability, one of the elements, one of the industries, one of the market sectors that is not well discussed is a service sector. A service sector sits at the center of the governance mechanisms and the built elements. A service sector potentially provides return on investment for those that are seeking to build. And at the same time, a service sector facilitates the objectives of governance in terms of making sure that those policies are operational. Questions of sustainability, stability, and balance are at the heart of this discussion. I used 2 examples of this to think in terms of balance. On the left side is a map of the Arctic Ocean from the perspective of the seafloor under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. On the right is a map of the water column, and in the center of the Arctic Ocean is the high seas. This is a region that is unambiguously beyond sovereign jurisdictions. So if we think in terms of the Arctic, in terms of sustainability, the types of things that we are looking to balance, to create stability, to create hope and opportunity and inspiration for future generations, certainly economic prosperity is at the top of the list. It's at the top of the list for a variety of reasons. It's not only for the communities and the peoples, but economic prosperity potentially is the single most important feature to drive stability of the region. One of the players in the Arctic, which is unambiguous in terms of its influence, is Russia. And from the perspective of Russia, its economic future is in the Arctic. It is contrary to Russia's interest to destabilize the region. And so in a very practical way, the economics of the Arctic will drive stability of the Arctic. Then we have environmental protection and societal well-being. These are all important to balance. No one is more important than the other. We have urgencies of the present, and we have needs of future generations. We have issues of promoting cooperation and preventing conflict. In terms of stability of the Arctic, it is the most basic foundation for any questions of economic prosperity. In the absence of stability, the region will not see the investment that is necessary. And we have the challenge of balancing national interests and common interests. In a sense, the Arctic coastal states are looking inward into the Arctic Ocean, and the center of the Arctic Ocean, the high seas, provides an opportunity for the international community to look outward in terms of their common interests. And in this sense, areas like Greenland are as equal as any other region on Earth in terms of facilitating dialogues to balance common interests in the Arctic Ocean. The high seas in the center of the Arctic Ocean is unambiguously beyond sovereign jurisdictions. I would just note in closing, next year in March, with the collaboration hosted by the government of Greenland in 2017, we will host the Ilulissat Summit, which is intended to be a visionary, international, interdisciplinary, and inclusive dialogue among high-level decision makers and global thought leaders to build common interests to achieve Arctic sustainability across the 21st century. Thank you very much.